Hey kiddos, and welcome to your video on aquatic life zones. This covers all of the non-Earth parts of the globe. They're equivalent to terrestrial biomes, and we split them into two major types, which should make sense to you. They're either going to be freshwater with no salt in them, or even the smallest amount of salt. We call those marine areas. You can further subdivide it by layer. The surface of a large body of water, the middle part and the bottom part. Why do we do that? Because of light. Light only penetrates so far in water. It can only get so deep. So in the light parts of the water where light can penetrate, you're going to have plant growth. You're going to have phytoplankton growth. That's little organisms that perform photosynthesis. That is called primary productivity, the plant growth. And, oh, by the way, if I'm saying things that you're like, oh, there's no space to write this, that's why you have blank paper, and you can take additional notes as you see fit. Also writing in the margins and all of that other good stuff. We will cover primary productivity again later in this unit, but I'm just kind of introducing it to you right now. Okay, primary productivity. The more types of plants you have, the more photosynthesis that's going on, the more biodiversity in general you're going to have. I mean, that should make sense. More plants, more organisms that depend upon those plants. So an overall higher biodiversity, with biodiversity just being the number of individuals you have in general, and then the number of species that you have specifically. Okay, so we're going to start with freshwater streams. Just a vocab word, if they connect to a larger river, they're called tributaries. No salinity, fast flow. Gravity powers the flow of rivers and streams. So if you don't have, if you're not going from a high point to a low point, you have a lake, basically. That's why the water doesn't move. Now the slope of the river from beginning to end determines the speed of the river. There are going to be some things that I'm going to show you later on when we start talking about watersheds that don't look like they're rivers, but they're actually rivers. They just flow very slowly because instead of having a steep angle like the side of a mountain, they're like the Everglades, where basically the highest point of the Everglades is inches higher than the lowest point. You're not talking about a lot of a tilt there, so it moves very slowly. The speed of rivers will come into play when we talk about other things like pollution and purification of water, but just right now kind of keep that in mind. Streams have very small fish and what are called macroinvertebrates in them. They are pollution intolerant, so they die off when there is pollution present, so they're called indicator species. You don't have to jot that down. We will cover that later on in the year. Just be aware that they're there. Indicator species tell us about, it's like, they're like fire alarms. We can keep track of these little guys, and if they start dying off, we know that the whole river is in trouble. So instead of monitoring everything, we can just monitor how many of these guys are there, and if they start disappearing, then we're like, oh, we need to fix something. There aren't any zones to a river, and it has pretty high productivity. Why? Because it's shallow. So that means that you're going to have a lot of light, so you're going to have plant growth. Provided, okay, the caveat here is provided that the stream is not moving so fast that plants cannot stay rooted. This is just kind of letting you know how this works. Don't copy this down. But if you are fascinated with anything that has to do with fresh water, you will become familiar with indicator species. Basically, the type of macroinvertebrate that is in the water tells you about the levels of pollution that are there. And by pollution, we usually mean high levels of the bad kind of nutrients, which come from usually like animal waste. So yeah, so that tells us about the health of the stream. Okay, freshwater rivers are basically bigger streams, no salinity, and just a medium flow. Again, the medium flow and the high flow really kind of depend upon the tilt of the river. It's just going to depend. Again, gravity powers the flow of the river. The slope of the river determines the speed of the river. Okay, so these aren't the zones. This is just me saying some things in general about the biota. I'm going to tell you what the zones are here in just a minute. So upstream, you have very few plants. It's got the deepest slope. That means it's got the highest tilt. So the water there is moving very fast. Because it's moving very fast and tumbling a lot, it has a lot of oxygen in it. It's also usually pretty cold because if you're up high, it's colder. And then also make a note to yourself that a lot of rivers are powered by either rain, which is cold, or from melted snowpacks, which is also, cold. So trout is the classic example of a fish that lives in upstream areas because they are muscular, they can stay in place when the water is moving very quick, they can tolerate the cold, but they also need high oxygen levels. Okay, downstream, you're going to have more plants because think what's happening. As the river rushes down from upstream to downstream, it's picking up all of this dirt, all of this sediment, and so it has more nutrients in it, so there's more plants. Rivers also flatten out and get wider and shallower, so it gets warmer. So you're going to have more plants there. You also are going to have fish that tolerate what's called turbidity. That is something that you're going to want to jot down somewhere. That is suspended soil particles. It just makes it look muddy. The water is also moving slower. Classic example there is catfish. Okay, so you should be able to differentiate between upstream and downstream. And the productivity is going to depend on the zone. And so we split rivers into 3 zones. Do know where the water starts. It's called the headwaters. Where it spits out into the larger body of water, whether it's a lake or an ocean, that's called the mouth. So there's 3 zones. This says label it. I should have done this. Well, actually, I did. The source zone is the kind of the top third part. The transition zone is where it starts to flatten out. You're also going to notice it starts to get like windier, bendier. The river is going to get wider here as well. It's going to get more turbid. That means, remember, more suspended particles in it. And then down here in the floodplain zone, it's flat. It's very bendy. Not a lot of tilt to it. The river's moving pretty slow. This is also where people end up living. We will talk about that later. People like to live near rivers just because of food sources, and you can also travel on a river. But anyway, those are the 3 zones. Up here at the top, the source zone, remember this is clear, cold, moving quickly, high oxygen. Down here is where it's more turbid, more plant life, warmer, shallower, broader across, flatter. Okay, and again, gravity. Hello. Okay, so I will embed this video for you to watch. It's a 2-minute video. This is actually kind of cool. We'll talk about this when we talk about speciation. But rivers naturally change course. That's what they're supposed to do. And they form these little things called oxbow lakes, which we'll talk about with speciation. They basically pinch off, and that's a lake in the shape of a bow, like a smile. And unique creatures end up evolving in those particular areas. So you can see here the river is still here, and you can see all the places that it's pinched off to form these rivers. So just kind of cool. You don't have to make note of this right now, but I'm just kind of showing you this kind of as a preview. Okay, moving on to ponds and freshwater lakes. They, you don't have to write what they're formed by, but how do these things form? Glaciers used to be there. Frozen water is heavy, so it would press down the earth and make these depressions, and then when the ice melted, filled the hole that it made and made lakes. Crustal displacement, we're going to talk about plate tectonics in another unit, so lakes can form that way, and then also volcanic activity. Zero salinity, there are maybe 1 or 2 saltwater lakes, don't worry about it though, and then it's still waters, it doesn't go anywhere. Vegetation and animal life varies by age of the lake. So here's what I mean. So there are 2 types of lakes that you need to know about. You can put this under the relative productivity section of your notes. New lakes are called oligotrophic lakes. They're clear, cold, deep, low nutrient content, high oxygen, not much plant or animal life, low productivity. So they're kind of like a source zone. And then you have eutrophic lakes. They're established, so stuff has died in there and built up the nutrients, so it's more turbid, it's warmer, it's shallower, higher nutrient content, lower oxygen levels in parts of the lake, usually the shallower parts, and then a high biodiversity and productivity. Oh, I forgot to tell you, your sketch notes, you should have been paying attention. There's a little thing for streams and rivers that you could use to kind of map out the zones. Okay, so here are the differences between mesotrophic. That prefix meso means like in between. So from oligotrophic to eutrophic. All lakes start out oligotrophic, and then they get to be eutrophic after especially dead and decaying stuff builds up over time. Okay, here are some examples of an oligotrophic lake on the left and a eutrophic lake on the right. If the stuff on the right looks familiar, it's because most of the lakes in Florida are eutrophic, largely because of, you know, it's warm here, so more decay, and so you're going to have more eutrophic. All that plant life in there is actually not a bad thing, it's just different. Okay, these are the zones of a freshwater lake, and you've got a, in your sketch notes, you have a place where you can draw all of this in. So you've got zones that go horizontally and zones that go vertically. So the first one is the Littoral Zone. It goes from the edge of the lake to where the last emergent plant, or where the last plant starts. The way I remember this is the littoral, it's two T's, like they're poking up out of the water. So this is where the plants are. Lots of light, shallow plants. So you can put this all in the zones. Limnetic Zone is the open water. It's the stuff in the middle. However, notice the Limnetic Zone. Oh, sorry. The Limnetic Zone also, not only does it go across, it goes down. It's everywhere in the pond that is open water with no rooted plants that also gets light. So that means that's where any other photosynthesis is going to go on. The Profundal Zone is the dark bottom of the lake. No light, therefore no plant life. And then the Benthic Zone is the entire muddy bottom of the pond or the lake. Here are some more details about this stuff. How much of this you choose to write down is up to you, but I'm just trying to give you an idea of how these zones are different. Littoral zones are going to be the warmest because they're the shallowest. Fairly diverse community because you got to think if there's plants, then you have little guys who can hide in the plants who are there. And it also acts as a place where other animals that do not live in the lake full time can find food. The Limnetic Zone, again, it's well lit, and this is where you have phytoplankton and zooplankton, and a variety of freshwater fish are in there. If you need a specific one, we have, you can say bass, freshwater bass. Let's go on. So, Profundal and Benthic zones are obviously going to be colder. They're denser. Remember, colder water has higher density, and that's why it sinks to the bottom. Little light penetrates down here, no photosynthesis. The benthic zone is where you have decomposers and filter feeders. They have to depend on whatever falls from the top layers of the lake. So they just sit there and kind of wait. But it's the entire muddy bottom from shallow all the way to deepest part. Okay, so moving on to wetlands, swamps, marshes, bogs. You can see there's like a whole bunch of different stuff. The definition for this is, hey guys, they're wet. They're not very deep, so they don't qualify as a lake, but they have water on them at least for part of the year. Some are year-round and some are seasonal. Definitely know that they act as, let me see where you can put this in your notes. You can put this under, honestly, relative productivity or wherever you like. Actually, you can put this in your sketch notes. Kind of know what these things do. They're important. They're filters, but what I mean by filters is they actually clean water by holding back sediment, and plants can actually remove some pollutants from the water. They reduce flooding and erosion. They replenish streams during dry periods because they just kind of act like as an extra, they're a reservoir of water. They recharge aquifers. You don't know what those are yet. Those are underground places to find fresh water. They maintain diversity, and how do they do that? They act as nurseries because there's a lot of plant life there, like a lot of plant life. It is a place where little guys can hide, so little fish, little birds, little baby birds and stuff go and hide there until they're big enough to be able to handle themselves. You do not need to know the definitions of all of this stuff. The only reason I really put marshes and swamps, the definitions, is because you live in a place with marshes and swamps. Everybody likes to call the Everglades the swamp. They're largely wrong, because swamps are basically lots of trees that grow in standing water, like cypress. The Everglades is largely a marsh, so lots of grasses and reeds with few trees. Prairie potholes are more common up north. Floodplains, which we saw with rivers, can be considered wetlands. And then the Arctic tundra, it gets so wet it's considered a wetland in the summer. Again, high biodiversity and productivity, tons of different kinds of plants and animals there. Very low to zero salinity, low to zero flow, and no zones. Here's an example, the Florida Everglades. Water actually flows here, so you could say it's kind of a cross between a marsh and a river. It does have wet and dry seasons. And here's where you find it. This is Lake Okeechobee. We're right in here, and the original Everglades flowed unbroken from Lake Okeechobee all the way down to the southernmost tip of Florida, and most of our drinking water used to be cleansed through its trip from Okeechobee down to the southern tip. Now, of course, it's broken. This entire area right here is used by agriculture, largely sugar. So it is not a fully functioning area. So I put us down too low. Well, actually, that's right. Naples, you guys live here. See, I live right there, so I'm up closer. Yeah, so that's an example. All right, the ocean. You do have sketch notes for this, so you can use that to draw things into your heart's content. You can see all of the different zones. The coastal, the intertidal zones, which is between high tide and low tide, we're really not going to talk about. Not super important, although you may want to make note that coral reefs are in the intertidal zone. Notice that zones go across and then also zones go down. So this is called the pelagic zone. Euphotic means full of light, and then down, again, we're obsessed with the light with all of this. That determines a lot of what's going on. Do you need to know these exact depths? No, not really. Just kind of know generalities here. And again, this does have a benthic zone. That's the only commonality between fresh and saltwater bodies of water. Is the benthic zone is the entire muddy bottom from the shallowest area to the deepest area. Okay, so coastal and intertidal zone, that should say nutrient rich. I will fix that before I post these slides. You don't need to know about this, just realize that it's an actual thing. Okay, so the open ocean is also called the pelagic zone. It is 35 parts per thousand salinity, generally cold. It's hard to give a temperature range. There's thermal stratification and constant mixing of warm and cold ocean currents. We will talk about the different ocean currents in a later unit. Phytoplankton is the big lowest level of the food chain. It is the foundation upon which all the food webs are based upon in that area. Now, the biodiversity and productivity is kind of tricky, so you're going to want to write it down in two ways. If you're talking about per unit area, it's really low. There's not a lot going on in the open ocean. Most of the productivity is going to be close to shore, where it's shallow and warmer. However, if you are ever asked what one area has the most total primary productivity, it's absolutely the ocean. Why? Because the majority of our planet is open ocean. So what it lacks in biodiversity per unit area, it makes up for in just sheer amount of what's going on. Okay, the euphotic zone is the ocean depths that receive light, so now we're going from top to bottom. That is going to be the place where you have the most productivity. Then you have the bathil zone. It's kind of called the twilight area. So that is the only light is from bioluminescent organisms. You largely only eat whatever falls from above. Water pressure is pretty considerable. Most animals are either black or red in color. We're actually going to be talking about this. Red Red doesn't make it down that far, so anything that's red actually looks black at that depth. And then you have the abyssal zone, which is the bottom. It is, stuff lives down there, but I don't even, it is hard to study specimens, because when you bring these specimens up to the surface, they're made for the high pressure, so they just fall apart if you bring them up to the surface. And then the benthic zone is the entire ocean floor, so from the shallowest bits that you walk in when you're at the beach all the way down to the very, very bottom of the ocean. So let me make sure that I covered all of this. Also, the ocean has currents, and then they have these things called gyres. We'll fill that in class. So the only zone that gets light, the only photic zone is that euphotic zone. The bathal zone and the abyssal zone can be considered to be aphotic, which is no light. Okay, so salt marshes and estuaries, we're going to come back to this again and again. These things are called brackish. That means that it's slightly salty water. It's where rivers meet the sea, and you have to imagine, because of high tide and low tide, that the salinity there varies. So you're going to want to make a note to yourself that it depends on the time of day and the time of year. They're partially enclosed, so that means that towards the riverside they're narrow, and then they kind of widen into this triangular shape called a delta that we'll talk about later as they move towards the ocean. So they can also be called coastal wetlands. That's another thing they can be called. We actually have one of the types of plants that are associated with coastal wetlands in Southwest Florida. They're called mangrove trees. You're going to want to make note of those, because those are going to be important. Super high biodiversity. They act as a unique habitat. They're a nursery for little critters. They filter water, and then they're storm breaks. And what that means is when things like storms and hurricanes come in, they prevent all of that water from surging up into rivers. If you've ever been through a hurricane, you know that the hurricane itself, while it's very windy, once it's done, it's done. It's that storm surge that's the problem. The storm pushes all this water up inland, and it can stay there for weeks. Mangrove forests kind of help to keep that from happening. And again, high variability of water flow. It depends on the tide. Sometimes the water's flowing out, sometimes it's flowing in, and then no zones. So here's what I'm talking about. You may want to kind of sketch this a little bit. This is called a delta. Why? Because it looks like a triangle. So, and then you can also see a lot of times there are these barrier islands that have formed from the plants and the sediment that have come out. This is like, if you've ever been there, Sanibel and Captiva Island. You have other smaller islands like off the coast of Collier County that would also qualify as barrier islands. And we'll discuss the importance of those a little bit later on too. Okay, so what kind of stuff can you find in there? Mangrove forests, seagrass, oysters on mangrove roots. This is actually from Pine Island, which is something in the general area, an island in the general area. And the cool part about mangroves, you may want to make a note of, is they have these roots that kind of make them look like they're walking. They're actually called walking trees by the Calusa Indians who used to live here. And that is in those little nooks and crannies where little fish will hide, which is also why birds like this guy will build their nests up here, because then they can just dip down and feed their young pretty easily. Okay, and the last thing I think we're going to talk about is coral reefs. It is the highest biodiversity in the ocean in one given area. 35 parts per 1,000 salinity, but the key here is that it gets a lot of light. These things are shallow, they're in the intertidal zone, right at the edge, and then sorry, I'm making a note to myself here because I need to add something. Lots of productivity. All right, let me go ahead and just get through this. So coral reefs are a structure formed by coral polyps. They're tiny animals that live in colonies. They're basically upside down jellyfish, and they have embedded in them the stuff that's called zooxanthellae or zooxanthellae, depends who you talk to. They have a mutualistic relationship. The polyps build structures out of what's called calcium carbonate. Definitely note all of this stuff down. to keep their little soft tissues safe, and in return, the zooxanthellae perform photosynthesis to help provide food for the polyps. So again, this is a mutualistic relationship. It's actually embedded in the skin of the polyp. It's the zooxanthellae that also gives it its characteristic color. There aren't any zones in coral reefs. It's kind of cool. As polyps die, new ones attach themselves to old ones, so they grow very slowly. So one kind of on top of another. Here is a island that is completely ringed by a coral reef, and that's why it's called an atoll, because it's almost a complete ring. Not that you need to know that, but it's actually kind of cool. You would also think that if you were an animal that wanted a safe place to be, that this would be a great place to come in here to kind of hang out for a while. Whales are actually known to find nooks and crannies between coral reefs and the larger lands that they're associated with, so that they can have their babies there and stick around until the babies are strong enough to go ahead and head out to the open water. These are all the places where you find coral reefs. Here in Florida, we actually have some. It's not just here. It's actually kind of on the other side of Florida as well. This one over here is probably the most well-known. It's a Great Barrier Reef. Yeah, so it's nutrient-poor water, but the polyps don't need it because they've got the zooxanthellae that perform photosynthesis for them. Lots of light, very warm. Coral does die if it gets too cold. And what's in there? Largely phytoplankton. You have algae. Algae is not a plant. Seaweed and seagrasses. You got tropical fish. It's just lots of stuff in here. It's like the tropical rainforest of the ocean, like I said. Okay, that is the end of the slideshow. We are going to talk about human interference on these aquatic life zones when we're together again, but that is enough for now. So I will talk to you later. Have a great day.